Good afternoon, and welcome to Stories in Stone. My name is Angie Lauhoff, and this is Rachael Wheeler. But we are the only actors who will be introducing ourselves to you this afternoon. From this point, you will be introduced to the actors only by the names of the historical figures that they represent. In our case, my name is Bertha Ritter Walburn, and this is my sister, Hattie Ritter Stein. The purpose of City Stage in performing Stories in Stone is threefold. First, we see the need to preserve Chillicothe's long and varied history. Second, we want to present that history in a way that's engaging to the community. And third, we want to illustrate the remarkable contributions thousands of people have made to make our community what it is today. Although a few of the citizens you will meet this afternoon would have been considered prominent, it is the stories of the individuals who would have been hidden from public eye that are among the most interesting. Ordinary people with extraordinary skills and resiliency worked to make Chillicothe prosperous and inviting.
As we stand here among these beautiful monuments, we must wonder what stories the stones themselves could tell. As you look behind me, you can see a marble monument with two books lying open. This monument marks the Markham tomb. Although you can see it as a lovely stone, few realize that this monument was once the pinnacle of a mausoleum that stood above the ground. The Markham tomb held dozens of Markham descendants until the mausoleum fell into disrepair and had to be dismantled in the 1940s. The Markhams are now underground. If you look behind you, you will see the Jewish section of the cemetery called Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai was once a separate cemetery with its own gate, but was incorporated into Edgewood in the 1950s. A stroll into the Mount Sinai section is a walk back into time. Surprising to many, there were more than 20 Jewish families living in Chillicothe from the 1850s to the turn of the century. The Lowensteins, Hanauers, Blocks, Eilenbergs, and many more. Some Chillicothe residents would be familiar to you, such as Dr. George Mandler and his wife, Erica, the Holocaust survivors who moved here in the 1950s. Other Jewish families begin their Chillicothe stories much, much earlier.
One example of a Jewish family that had significant influence on Chillicothe's early years was that of the Walburn family. The Walburn stones tell a story of immigration. The large obelisk in Mount Sinai belongs to Jacob Walburn, born in Bavaria in 1798. Jacob and his wife Regina they had 5 children: Daniel, Abraham, Henry, Caroline. Also all born in Bavaria. But in 1852, at the age of 18, Daniel immigrated to the United States, stayed briefly in New York, and then came to Chillicothe. His brothers and sisters all joined him here throughout the 1850s and 1860s. It was after his mother passed away that his father also immigrated here. The Walburns soon saw a need for a clothing industry in the growing town of Chillicothe. Daniel, Abraham, and Henry soon established a store they called the Walburn Brothers Store, and soon after had a building erected to hold that establishment. That building still stands today, what many think of as the J.C. Penney building and what currently holds the Ballet Arts Dance Studio. The Walburns' reputation for honest goods at honest prices prospered their business, and at one time the Walburns owned a significant portion of that block on Locust Street, as well as a portion of the west side of the square. They also built elegant homes in the 800 block, one which stood where the newspaper parking lot currently is and where the old Ben Bolt Theater once stood.
All 5 of the Walburn children married, and all except Leopold stayed in Chillicothe. Jacob's daughter Caroline married Herman Berg, and from their union came Herman Berg Jr. The Bergs and Walburns began a millinery store called the Palace of Fashion, located on the west side of the Chillicothe Square at the current location of Friend's Clothing Store. Mr. Berg also started a restaurant and confectionery store called the Silver Moon. Herman Berg Sr. passed away at a young age, and so Caroline remarried Mr. Lewis Ritter. From their union came 2 daughters, Bertha and Hattie. The marriage between Mr. Ritter and Caroline Walburn lasted only 10 years, as he was thrown from a train car of the Hannibal-St. Joseph Railroad.
By the 1880s, the Walburns had amassed a considerable estate. The tax records of the time indicate assessment on a large fortune, and other personal effects such as a gold watch and a one-horse buggy, each of which was taxed $1. It is at this time, though, that myself, Bertha, and my sister Hattie each married. At 30 years old, I married Joseph Walburn, a first cousin 10 years my senior. Our union produced no children, but we lived happily in Chillicothe until our deaths. Joseph was a charter member of the Elks Lodge, served the First Ward as its councilman, and was a member of the Chamber of Commerce. Joseph and I often spent time with our Uncle Daniel and his wife Emily, who also had no children. Daniel, who was fond of gardening, was rarely seen without a flower in the lapel of his coat.
It was my wedding to Morris Stein in 1887, however, that was the social event of the season. The newspaper held column after column of the grand affair that was my wedding. The society papers were enraptured with the silk dresses, the floral decorations, the gourmet meals, the attentive ushers, and the orchestra accompanied dancing. The rabbi's sermon is printed word for word, as well as a list of wedding gifts, such items as a set of parlor furniture, 157 pieces of Dresden china, and 5 marble mantel clocks. We received nearly 50 congratulatory telegrams from New York, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and dozens of other places, including one from Missouri Governor Marmaduke. Our guests danced well into the night, dancing waltzes, polkas, and quadrilles. My marriage to Morris lasted only 18 years as he passed away from kidney trouble, but from our marriage came one son, Louis Henry Stein, but whom many called Judy. And with Louis, the Walburn family story comes full circle, from Jacob born in 1798 to Louis born 101 years later, from one Bavarian immigrant to an extended family who served Chillicothe and helped make it prosper. My son Louis served both in World War I in a battalion and in World War II, providing specialized training for dogs. After World War II, Judy returned to Chillicothe and became a custom tailor out of his office in the Wallburn building. He was a charter member of the Lions Club, the American Legion Post, and a 50-year member of the Masonic Lodge. In the 1960s, Judy Stein was elected mayor of Chillicothe, although he was not the first Jewish mayor Chillicothe elected. That honor went to Moses Alexander in the 1880s, who went on to become governor of Idaho. Judy was the last of the Walburn descendants to make Chillicothe his home. He had no children, though he was a stepfather to his second wife, Margaret Phillip's son, Bob. With Judy, the Walburn family story ends.
The Walburn family history is the longest story you will hear this afternoon, but before we send you on your way, we would like to ask a few things of you out of respect for the dignity of this beautiful location. First, please do not applaud. Our purpose here today is education, not entertainment. Second, please stay on the paved roads. If you would like to examine the monuments you've seen today more closely, then please come back at a later time. For the rest of this week, each stone will have a flag nearby to help you locate it. Third, in the interest of time, please do not ask any questions. If you do have questions about what you have seen or heard here this afternoon, then please direct those questions to Lisa Rule at the gate at the conclusion of the tour. Thank you for coming to hear Stories in Stone. And now, you can proceed to the next story, Johnny Rucker.
My name is Johnny Rucker. Some of you may know me because I'm one of the most visited stones here in Edgewood, and because of the sad story that goes along with my death. I was born in 1859, although you wouldn't be able to read that from my stone. In 1859, Chillicothe was only 20 years old. But in 1859, I was born to my parents, John and Sarah Rucker. My father first made his living off of tobacco farms, and later, tobacco factory and warehouse that was here in Chillicothe. Chillicothe was known for its tobacco. In fact, they even later sold their own cigar called Chillicothe for a nickel each. But a tobacco man doesn't make a lot of money, so me and my family were far from rich. But we did have friends, and I had a true friend in the form of my dog. Now, the story goes that my dog followed this little mask around everywhere he went, and that's mostly all true. But what some of you may not realize is, I was no boy when I died. I was 21, a man really, at least in body. You see, the 1870 census records show that Johnny Rucker was an 11-year-old boy, but he wasn't like most other kids at the time. While most kids were at school, learning math, and reading books, I was at home, skipping rocks, climbing trees, helping my mom in the kitchen, and playing fetch with my dog. The 1870 census records also show that while my parents could read and write, I was not able to. Those 1870 census records hint that Johnny Rucker was just a boy who'd never be able to fully grow up. My dog is the only animal buried with permission in Edgewood Cemetery. That's because then, just like it is now, they're not able to bury an animal in a place that is meant for humans. But when I died in 1880, I was most likely taken to the Minor Shagan Funeral Parlor on the square. There, they held my service, and afterwards, my family and friends got together, took the long walk on the old dusty trail here to Edgewood Cemetery. Somewhere along the way, my dog joined in with the mourners and came along with them. After my burial, my dog just sat and stared at the freshly turned soil. My parents tried to move him through force and bribery, but he wouldn't budge. Finally, they had to leave him. My dog stayed by my side until death came to his poor little body too. My parents petitioned to have him buried with me as well, and the townsfolk knew of the boy in the man's body, and the dog who loved him so relented and gave permission. So, here we lie, dog and master, innocent boy and loyal friend, a monument to the affection of the people of Chillicothe shared with one of their own.
I married a man who had small beginnings, but big plans. Big plans. Alexander Dockery was born in 1845, southeast of Gallatin, in a log cabin, where he later became a doctor, a banker, and one of the most influential men in Missouri's politics. My father, Greenup Bird, met the new young doctor in Chillicothe and knew he had plans that included me. My father, who was the first cashier at the Chillicothe Savings Association, did not have an issue with him courting me, and neither did I. And at the age 18, I, Margaret Bird, became Mrs. Margaret Dockery. We were so happy in those years, and everything was so exciting and fun. But then I noticed Alexander just wasn't into his medicine. He'd say to me, "Molly, I love the people, but I can't see me doctoring for the rest of my life." So I guess I shouldn't have been surprised when an investment opportunity in a bank came up in Gallatin and we moved. The people there were so wonderful and accepting and loving, they took us right in. He went on to be voted as one of the school board members, was elected on city council, and later became mayor. We were so excited about being there when all of a sudden my husband said, "You know what? I'm going to run for Congress." Well, Alexander ran for Congress and he won on the Democratic ticket. We were so excited about packing our bags for Washington, D.C. I packed his clothes and my clothes, but sadly, no children's clothes. We had lost beautiful babies before moving to Washington, D.C. But I had hope. We made the Willard Hotel our home while we were there. I spent most of my time in the correspondence office, writing letters and reading all the local newspapers to keep Alexander abreast of what was happening back home. Another one of my duties was hosting receptions for the Washington Society. Many of the congresswomen loved this aspect of it. I found little pleasure in it. You see, Alexander and I were kind of the plainer of the bunch. I couldn't keep Alexander in his coat, no matter what, if the weather was nice, and do you think I could keep that half-chewed stub of cigar out of his mouth, no matter who the company was? He did learn a lot, and politically, there was things he agreed with and didn't agree with. He did not agree with the annexation of the Philippines, nor did he want Idaho and Wyoming to become states. Did you know Wyoming was even going to let women vote? He did agree also, though, in the Spanish-American War. He believed after so many years of division of the Civil War, they needed this to bring themselves together. And Missouri sold $500,000 worth of horses and Missouri mules to the war effort. We relocated back in Gallatin every summer, where you could also find Alexander in a straw hat and boots along the volunteer road crews. He loved his people here, and we did so much. Well, at that point, he decided, after 16 years in Washington, D.C., that it was time to run for governor. So in 1900, he ran for governor and won. We were so excited about packing our bags and leaving Washington, D.C. to go to Jefferson City. I packed his clothes, I packed my clothes, but sadly, no children's clothes. At the age of 47, I had lost 8 children. Frank, Edward, Ida Bird, Lena Carey, Thomas Ewing, Charles Irvin, William Villas, and Alexander Monroe. 8 little mounds, 8 dreams unfulfilled. It was later found that I had a heart ailment, and that's why there was many times I was weak. When we moved to Jefferson, I was so excited about going there and moving in. But being a practical woman, a little superstitious, knew I didn't move in on a Friday, so we waited for the next day to move into our home. When we got there, I was appalled. There was not any furniture, and it was quite run down. You see, the past governor had taken all his fine furnishings. At that time, the mansion did not own its own things. Everybody took their own. Well, but you know what? There wasn't even a place to hang your hat. So it wasn't long that I planned a trip to St. Louis for furniture, fabric, and artwork. I was starting to get weak. I tried to keep it from Alexander the best I could, because it only worried him. In the year of 1902, I took to my bed more often, but I still ordered all the cooking and decorating done from that second floor bedroom. But we were planning the holiday reception when I finally failed. January 1, 1903, I passed away from a heart attack. My funeral was held that afternoon amongst the red, white, and blue flags and bunting. The next afternoon, I was laid to rest here with my children. Alexander never remarried, but threw himself even more into politics. He became the 3rd Assistant Postmaster General and sold over $1 billion worth of saving stamps for a World War I effort. Alexander himself had a intestinal disorder that would give him hiccups days on end. After moving back, and found that his bank had gone bankrupt, and most of our wealth went with it. Alexander finally failed himself, being penniless and suffering from an intestinal disorder that the doctors never could cure. My husband had hoped to leave an inheritance to the local church and the park, but instead he left an inheritance of integrity and honor to public service.
My name is Katie S. Milbank, and I was born in Chillicothe in 1883. My stone says Little Kate, but my brothers and sisters called me Kitty. I was the youngest of 9 children, born to my parents George and Sarah Milbank, who were almost 50 when I was born. I also had a sister named Nellie who died young, whose stone is here. My father came to America in 1855 from England. He lived in Ohio, then in St. Louis, then in Troy, Illinois, where he met and married my mother. They came here in 1867 when my father bought a field of oats where Hy-Vee is today. This field then became the city mills, which turned out about 150 barrels of flour a day by the time I was born. Growing up, I lived in a big house next to the city mills, next to Community Press, and I must have had a beautiful voice. When I was 6 years old, I was an operetta at the City Hall. When I was 8 years old, I died of a disease called diphtheria, also known as Membranous croup, which many children contracted from raw, unpasteurized milk. The infant mortality rate today is 1 in 150. When I was born, every 1 in 5 babies died at a young age and even more before they were teenagers. Although my life was brief, I was said to be the joy of my family and beloved by all who knew me.
My name is Landon Johnson, and I am known as one of the first black men buried in the Edgewood Cemetery. History does not record much of my life, but what is known shows that I was a selfless, honorable man. Census records show that I was born between 1830 and 1840 in Virginia, most likely born in the property of either James or Susan Turner's family. When James and Susan married, they most likely moved their family from Virginia to Livingston County to establish a tobacco farm, which was a common occupation in the 1860s. Slavery was common also. Although Livingston County had a small percentage of slave-owned compared to some of the neighboring counties, in 1860 census shows that nearly 1 in 10 people living here were enslaved. James and Susan do not appear in Livingston County's census records, so we know very little of their life and their marriage. And it is not known when James died. We do know that my sister and I are listed as property of Susan Turner in 1851, accounting of Livingston County slave owners. Our value is estimated at $600. In 1851, Susan also made a will out, and it left, in it, she left $1 to each one of her granddaughters and asked that her 3 slaves, Billy, Landon, and Elizabeth, be set free upon her death. Susan died in 1853 and was buried in the city cemetery on Wilson Street. The cemetery no longer exists, but was located near what we now know as the Sargent Glass Company. Where I went after Susan's death is unknown, but when the Civil War ended, I returned to Chillicothe in 1867 as a free man. I could not read or write at that time, but I did get a very good job at that time being a porter at the New York store. The New York store was a thriving establishment for many, many years and had more than one location in Chillicothe. During the time I worked for the New York store, it was owned by Colonel McVeigh and was situated on Washington Street in what is now labeled the Lambert building. It later moved into a building with top corners. By 1887, the old city cemetery on Wilson Street was in disarray. It had been very heavily vandalized, and most of the bodies buried there had already been moved to new locations, many to the Edgewood Cemetery in the 1860s and 1870s. But the body of Susan Turner had not been moved. I collected my savings and arranged to have my former owner's body moved to Edgewood Cemetery. Since the grave at the city cemetery had not been marked or the marker was lost, I asked those moving the body to open the casket and make sure she was the one that was being moved. I knew she had been buried in a plaid dress, and they made sure it was her and moved her just on the other side of this hill. I also paid for the stone to mark her resting place. It reads Susan, wife of James Turner, died June 29, 1853, in her 79th year. It is decorated with a weeping willow. When Colonel McVeigh found out what I had done, he was very touched by the act. He expressed his appreciation to me by purchasing me an expensive, fine, black gold-headed walking stick. What I have here is not quite that, but it is tucked away in a very safe place. But I told him that what I really wanted was to be buried beside Mrs. Turner when my final time came. At that time, black people were not allowed to be buried in this section of the Edgewood Cemetery. Colonel McVeigh himself, at the time, was a member of the cemetery board, and he assured me he would do what he could. Colonel McVeigh was a very good employer, and I worked for him for 40 years. Even when I was getting older and could not do my job duties because of my age, Colonel McVeigh created a night watchman job for me to continue to work for him. Again, I was known as a kind and selfless man, just one of many who made Chillicothe home. My sister Elizabeth also made Chillicothe her home and lived with me for many years in my house on Webster Street. In 1909, I passed away from heart trouble. My death made the front page of the newspaper as a beloved employee of the New York store. High praise for a community that was then very segregated. My wish was granted. I was buried beside Mrs. Turner as requested. My grave remained unmarked until 1950, when Vince Moore of the Moore Monument Company learned of my story. He himself marked my place of rest with a granite stone.
Good afternoon. I am George Asbury Smith. My grave lies just there, where the yellow flag is. The stones you see before you here that are identical belong to the McBride brothers. All three soldiers from the Union Army. I didn't fight in the war. I was too young. I was but a boy. But like Governor Dockery, I saw the horrors the war inflicted upon our nation. I was born in Caldwell County, Tennessee in 1849. I was the eldest of 10 children, all of whom pursued the noble vocation of teaching. After I finished my education, I became the superintendent of schools in Kirksville, following a teaching career there. And then later, in Trenton, I became the superintendent of schools. I became the president of Humphreys Business School, the superintendent of Chillicothe Public Schools, and taught in the Mouton Business School, which was on the square here in Chillicothe. In 1881, I joined the faculty of the Chillicothe Normal School, which was later known as the Chillicothe Business College. I taught there for 10 years and helped develop their teacher development program. At the school, students could enroll in such areas as pedagogy, the study of teaching, business, bookkeeping, science, elocution, photography, and the classics. It was a beautiful campus, not far from here. The campus had dormitories for both men and women, a gymnasium, and many classrooms. I retired, and they renamed the school the Chillicothe Business College. My 10-year career, I established the reputation that led to the nationally acclaimed business college. In that time, from the 20s and 30s, 1,500 students a year were trained at the business college. During the 1940s and World War II, Army, Air Corps, and FBI personnel were all trained there, 3,000 of them. I mentioned the military a moment ago. Let me tell you a little story about a young man named John Pershing. In 1881, when I was the superintendent of Trenton Schools, I was approached by Congressman James Burroughs to establish an examination to be given to young men who wished appointments to West Point. Congressman Burroughs did not like the standard way that these appointments were given out, that being to political donors and to family friends. I, along with some other faculty members, did create such an examination, and it had scores of information on it. In 1881, 7 young men took that test. 2 tied for the first place. A young man from Carroll County, whose name is lost to history, and young John Pershing. One of my colleagues suggested we flip a coin to determine who got the appointment, but coin flipping is not allowed in education. So I made up another question. I gave them each the sentence, "I love to study," and I asked each what the objective of to study was. The young man from Carrollton stated he believed it was an adverb. Young Pershing thought about it a moment and stated love was the verb for the infinity object to study. He was correct, won the appointment, and the rest, as they say, is history. If one was to write my personal history, it would be 4 sections. Family, dedication to education, my allegiance to the Masonic body, and my hobbies. As a young man, I developed a keen interest in horticulture and apiculture, beekeeping. It is these hobbies that I believe have kept me vigorous through my 85th year. Many times, I walk from my home in Chillicothe to my orchards 3.5 miles northwest of town. In an interview given shortly before my death, the interviewer asked me for my ideas on sane living. How could we produce that? How did I do it? And I stated these remarks. I have never used tobacco in any form. I do not know the taste of intoxicating liquors. I do not pay attention to germs, microbes, and vitamins. I give my stomach what it calls for. I know I have a heart and lungs, but I do pay them very little attention. If I ever had high or low blood pressure, I would not know it, for I've never had it checked. I get plenty of exercise, I sleep on feathers, and I avoid worry. When I was a young lad, I played cat-ball and run the base, but I never learned to shoot craps, play pool, or play bridge. With that prescription for sane living in hand, I might have lived forever. However, I was killed in an automobile accident on the road to Cameron in 1935.
As you folks have walked around this circle, this loop here, you've heard the stories of many fine and true people. You're going to have to listen to my story and decide if I deserve to be in that group or not, because my story's a bit different. My name is William O. Jennings. I was born in 1814 in Kentucky. Now, Shelby County, Kentucky. Now, back then, 1814, that's pretty early on in the life of this country. In fact, is only the 4th president, James Madison, was in charge back east back then. Now, like I say, not much going on. To get the dates right on some things, in 1837, and then President Andrew Jackson wrote legislation to create Livingston County. That was in the state of Missouri. After he did that, the summer of 1837, Governor Boggs, he selected 3 county judges. It was Joseph Cox, Reuben McCoshry, and John, and I can't remember his name. There was one county clerk, Thomas Bryan, and myself, I was sheriff. And we are the first politicians of Chillicothe. We had our first meeting August 1837 in Cox's Barn, about 3 miles north of town here. That's when we selected the name Chillicothe. It's a Shawnee Indian word meaning our big town. There's nothing big about us at the time. Why, the first white settler, Samuel Todd, 1831, up by Utica, and Joseph Cox, he was the first settler that would be in what would be Chillicothe Township. See, there's nothing big about us at the time. A few families that moved in back then. There was the McCoshrys and the Coxes, the Gobins, the Austins, people coming through. But remember, this was the frontier at the time. But if you wanted to work hard, we had good hunting, we had good land, we had good soil. If you wanted to work hard, you could make a living doing lots of things. Some people even thought the honey we had around here had special medicinal properties. So people was coming through. That included the Mormons. Now, we didn't much like the Mormons. We didn't want them settling in Livingston County. There's about 8 or 10 families of them up by Dawn. One of them, Jacob Hahn, he had a mill up there. Now, they seem like they're nice enough folk, but he was their leader, Joseph Smith, declared that God had given Missouri to the Mormons. And they believed it. We didn't like that kind of thinking very much, because we were here too. And me as sheriff, I was always having to do something with the Mormons. Something happened to them, they did something back. It was on and on, over and over again. People were complaining to Governor Boggs to do something about the Mormons. And there was even one particular tense incident with the Mormons and a cannon people might have heard about. That was very, very rough. Now, it finally got to the point, October 27th, 1838, Governor Boggs wrote a law saying all Mormons had to leave the state of Missouri. You can imagine, within news that something like that would travel fast. Within 2 days, 8 or 9 companies of militiamen had mustered in a ride to Hahn's mill. Now, some people say I was in charge that day. I wasn't. My father, Thomas Jennings, led the troops. But I was there. Yes, I was. We rode on that little village. There was tents and wagons and women and children running around. Now about 30 men. There was 240 of us. As we approached, their leader came out, hat in hand, waving it to gesture of peace. Well, there's going to be no peace that day. As we got closer, somebody opened up fire, and all hell broke loose. An hour and a half later, when smoke cleared, there were 17 dead Mormons on the ground, including a little boy and an old man who had already surrendered his musket. 240 of us, 30 of them, all sanctioned by the government. It was legal. I was 24 years old at the time. I would like to think if I'd been older and wiser, made some other choices, but you can't undo something like that. I lived the rest of my days here in Chillicothe, built a house on the corner of Walnut and Cooper, had 9 children. Last one came when I was 45 years old. But I didn't get to live to see him grow up. January 30th, 1862, I was shot in the back in the doorway of my own house. No one saw the shooter. No arrests were made. No justice served. My stone here, it says, shot in the dark, O band of thieves, where art thou? I died the next day in great agony. Now, why was I murdered? Was it because of that day at the mill? Maybe, but it had been 20 years, over 20 years. Was it because I was a Southern sympathizer, had a slave, and the Civil War had broke out? Maybe. Maybe it's because I was been sheriff all these years. And back then you got crossed with the people keeping the peace. And someone wanted payback. We will never know.
My name is Christian Boehner, and I was born the eldest of 6 children in 1856 in Berg, Germany. When my father died when I was just 15, I faced conscription into the German army. Instead of allowing that to happen, I scraped together enough money to board a boat to America. When I arrived, I made my way to Chicago, only to find it in ashes after the Great Fire. I took the rest of my money and boarded a train headed west, as far west as I could go. Now, the money ran out in St. Joseph, Missouri. I contracted a job there with a butcher for 3 years. I learned the butchering trade, and at the end of my term, I was 18 and $200 richer. I first left St. Joseph and went to Brookfield to set up a shop. But the railroads and the people were in Chillicothe. Chillicothe was the place to be. So at 21, I moved to Chillicothe and brought my capital and set up a butcher shop on 3rd Street. My business prospered. I negotiated a contract with the Hannibal St. Joseph Railroad to supply meat to their crews, and I became known for fresh quality meats at honest prices. Roast would cost you 7 cents a pound, and steak would cost you 8.5 cents a pound. At 22, I married Minnie Tuitt, and she was a girl from Brookfield, and we had 2 children. Tragically, Minnie and the children all passed away in the flu epidemic of 1884. family was very important to me, and the loss of those three made me so despondent I nearly went back to Germany. But Minnie's father encouraged me to stay. In 1886, I married Mary Krause, and our family began to grow. We had 6 sons and 3 daughters. I owned some property along Dickinson Street. I had a barn that stood where Tom Chapman lives today, and I started construction on a house on the southeast corner of Calhoun and Dickinson. I wanted it to stand strong, so I poured the foundation and let it cure a year before I started building it. Of course, the business kept me occupied. I had moved the market from 3rd Street to the 500 block of Locust, where the Citizens Bank and Trust drive-through is today. I own the entire building, big enough for 3 storefronts, mine in the middle, and 2 grocery stores on either side, all next door to the onion-topped New York store. Of course, that was the retail business, but for years we did our butchering in the building behind what is known as the Windle or Hecker home, between United Methodist Church and Simpson Park. A second building stood nearby that was lined with cork. In it we stored ice packed in sawdust that was cut from the Boehner pond each winter. The water for the pond was vital to the slaughtering process. Water was heated with steam to get hot water to butcher and render the tallow and lard for the meat. In the winter of 1892, we packed over 2,000 hogs, in addition to cows and sheep. My sons all worked with me in the meat business. They milked cows, ran cows from pasture to pasture, and made meat deliveries. But they liked to fool around a little bit. When one of them would see me coming, they would yell hamburger to alert the others to get back to work. I was a loving father, always taking care of my children, but I had one rule. No German was to be spoken in our home. Both my wife and I spoke German, but I insisted they speak English. America had offered me a fresh start, and I wanted them to have every opportunity. In 1893, I became a naturalized citizen and embarked upon years of public service. I served on the school board, and from 1903 to 1911 was the presiding judge of the county. And for 2 years after that, I served as the mayor. In those days, we dealt with the growing pains of our community. Laws had to be passed against spitting on sidewalks, and for having a sidewalk gate swing inside instead of out. Phone service was established with just 16 phones, but grew to over 700 in just a few years. Free rural postal service was established. Lawsuits were filed and settled over broken wooden sidewalks and failed buggy wheels. Roads were being planned and built, and by the end of my term, 25 roads led to Chillicothe. And my administration saw the first city electricity used and a municipal power and light plant built. Salesmen coming through the area often said we had one of the best lighted cities from near and far. And those salesmen, by the way, often stayed at the Leeper Hotel for just $2 a day. Of course, we had our share of problems too. Chillicothe had voted out the sale of intoxicating liquors, so we were a dry city for many years. But that led to bootlegging and homemade stills. And with the advent of so many automobiles, laws had to be passed how an automobile should pass a horse and wagon. And with all the new technology came deaths from exploding gas lamps and electrical appliances, but it continued to be a good place to grow and prosper. I died in 1937 at the age of 81. I had seen many changes in our small community as we grew from a town to a city. Hard work, long hours, and honest dealings had brought prosperity to my name and my family's name. It was often said about me that Mr. Boehner owns all he now possesses himself, the result of earnest hard labor. For a penniless boy from Germany, America, Missouri, and Chillicothe had made this immigrant's dreams come true.
My name is Martha McConnell Leeper, but you can call me Maddie, as many of my friends did. I was born in Findlay, Ohio in 1853 and became the second wife of Andrew Leeper in 1874, his first wife having passed away. Andrew came from Fulton to Chillicothe in 1854 with his parents, his father becoming the first city banker just a year or so after. Andrew grew up here, but as a young man traveled to California and lived for several years. He did not serve in the Civil War. A military duty roster indicated he had a physical disability. In his late 20s, he returned to Chillicothe and taught school for several years before we were married. But after we married, Andrew was a hardware merchant and then later a real estate entrepreneur. Having been to California and having seen the fine hotels in the cities, Andrew knew that Chillicothe needed a hotel to match its rising prominence. So, in 1884, Andrew and his business partner, Sidney McWilliams, built the Leeper Hotel on the land where his father's bank had been. Andrew's father agreed to this plan only if he could place his bank in the lobby of the new hotel. The Leeper was built to be very fine, even taking advantage of the new electricity that was running 6 days a week in Chillicothe in 1885. The hotel was built originally with 3 floors and 50 rooms, but was so inundated with business that a 4th floor was added in 1915. Several businesses besides the bank flourished out of the 1st floor. A barbershop, a massage parlor, rooms for baths, and later the Ishmael and Allen motor bus and baggage business. Rooms at the Leeper were rented for $2 a night, which included a fine dinner, a puree of tomato soup, boiled tongue with tartar sauce, sirloin of beef, leg of lamb with mint sauce, spring chicken a la Maryland, mashed potatoes, corn on the cob, June peas, pickled beets, apple pie, lemon pie, and chocolate ice cream. Andrew and I roomed at the hotel for quite some time while building our lovely red brick home at 910 Washington, where the Lindley Funeral Home would be today. We lived in Chillicothe for many happy years. I was active in the Chillicothe Culture Club and helped raise money for the parish house at Grace Episcopal Church. Andrew was a prominent businessman and was responsible for bringing in many new shops and the Milwaukee Rail. He served as a mentor to several young men, pointing them on their way to success. When Andrew retired, we traveled extensively, visiting all the prominent points of interest in the United States and then in foreign nations. On a trip to Italy, we saw the work of a young sculptor named Raffaello Romani and promptly purchased the angel monument you see behind us. The Romanelli family sculptors had sculptures all over the world, even several in Kansas City purchased by J.C. Nichols. You can see the Romanelli inscription in the base of the angel. When Andrew passed away in 1912 from a stomach paralysis brought on by drink, I had his name inscribed on the monument along with the name of our infant daughter, Jean. And although I am buried here as well, my name is nowhere to be found. I spent my last years in Kansas City creating scrapbooks and corresponding with many friends. I died in 1937 from pneumonia. In my last will and testament, I am quite generous. I leave gifts for family members and special friends, but I also specified $3,000 to erect a granite monument to be installed when this marble one has deteriorated or crumbled. And I leave $10,000 to the city of Chillicothe to build a city library, which I would have liked to be called the Leeper Library. And with it, I wanted a bronze plaque with the inscription, "This building was given to the citizens of Chillicothe, Missouri by Martha Hardy Leeper as a memorial of her husband, Andrew Leeper, and herself." Unfortunately, my generosity was much larger than my actual estate, so the granite monument and the library were not to be. Andrew would still be proud, however. The Leeper Hotel stood for many years before being razed and catching fire. And aside from the loss of a few fingers, the Leeper Angel, as my monument is called, happily has endured well over the last 100 years.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Arthur J. Simpson, and many in Chillicothe know my name because Simpson Memorial Park is named in my honor. My stone and the stones of many people in my family are up there on that hill. My grandparents moved to Livingston County, Tennessee, Virginia in the 1840s and 1850s. My father, Dr. William Robert Simpson, was born in Spring Hill. I was born near Spring Hill in 1874. My mother was then 18 and my father was 28 and already living the life of a town physician. In fact, in addition to his private medical practice, he also served as a physician to the state industrial home for workers. I so admired my father that after completing my public education here in Chillicothe, I enrolled in the University Medical College in Kansas City, where I graduated at the age of 21. Shortly thereafter, I married the love of my life, Miss Alta Taylor, and we settled in Chillicothe in our home on Webster Street. Chillicothe was a bustling town in those days. No longer was our town center used for corralling pigs, but instead was known for its beautiful oak trees. Also around that same time, our fire department was famous for its horses, Joe and Dan, because Joe and Dan owned the world's record for fastest fire run. The firemen could hitch up Joe and Dan, run 600 feet, pull out 100 feet of hose, and start the water in 40 seconds. That was tremendous. And it was tremendously important because Chillicothe lost a number of buildings to fire in those days. Now, when I came out of medical school, our hospital was run by the Sisters of St. Mary. The nuns had run the hospital for many years, and they were truly a blessing for this town. But ultimately, my partner and I, Dr. Grace, took over operation of the hospital. We tended to many bedsides, held many hands, and babies. Oftentimes, for individuals and patients who could not pay for our services. But that was okay because we were blessed and we were happy to serve our community. And when I was not spending time with my lovely wife or tending to my patients, I still found time to be involved in the community as a member of the Masons, the Rotary Club, as well as the local Elks Lodge. I also found it important to stay up to date on the latest medical techniques and procedures, and I did so by attending seminars in St. Louis, Chicago, New York, and even Vienna, Austria. In 1902, I became the first person in Livingston County to own an automobile. It was a beautiful movie. The going was slow, as our county did not have a single paved road, but it was progress. And soon other gentlemen followed my lead and purchased automobiles of their own. My wife Alta and I were not blessed to have children of our own. Children of Chillicothe were important to us. And for good reason, because I delivered a good number of them. So in 1928, I purchased 21 acres of land north of town. We deeded it to the city for use as a city. I also commissioned a landscape architect to set out the features of the park, including where the playground was to go, the pool was to go, and the various pieces of equipment. I also hired the Chillicothe Foundry to manufacture all of the equipment, including tables and benches. I paid for it all out of my own pocket. But it was worth it. Because when the park was complete, to see the children of our town congregate and play in that park was worth every minute and every dollar. In 1933, at the age of 59, I passed away. So beloved was I that the mayor signed a proclamation closing all shops and businesses during the hours of my funeral. A couple years after my death, my lovely wife and former partner donated the hospital, its contents, and the land upon which it stood to the city. I was proud to call Chillicothe home as when my parents were before me. It was a city of progress, and I was glad to be a part of it. Thank you.
When I think of Chillicothe, I think of compassion. This community had extended its hand in friendship to me and my family, frankly, at times when we needed it the most. I'm Nelson Kneass. I was born in 1823, and at a very young age, my family had recognized in me my musical genius. But in the 19th century, it was difficult for a musician to make a name for oneself. So my wife and I, we assembled a troupe of performers, of actors, of singers, of musicians. And we traveled east to west and west to east and east to west again, and with a fair measure of success. But my real claim to fame came in 1848 when I had put to music a poem that was written by a Philadelphia doctor whose name was Thomas Dunn English. Well, that song, Ben Bolt, quickly became one of the most requested and beautiful songs that had ever been composed. Well, my wife and I, we performed that music for over 20 years, until 1869. I had fallen ill during a performance over in Cameron, which is about 3 whistle stops down the line. And our next engagement was right here in Chillicothe, so we returned to Chillicothe. I was staying at the Browning House Hotel, which is where your hometown pharmacy is now. Well, 2 friends of mine, Colonel W.D. Leach and a Captain McVeigh, had become aware of my condition, and so they had enlisted the services of Dr. Boehner, who happened to have an office just right next door. Well, I don't know whether my condition was so far gone or whether they should have gone a little farther down the road for seeking medical help, but I passed away 3 days later. Well, Leach and McVeigh, they saw fit to give me a proper burial right out here at Edgewood Cemetery. It was right up by where the gazebo is up here. And initially they used a wooden marker that was just tacked to a tree that had my name on it, but it didn't last long. So the people of Chillicothe came together again and they bought a beautiful white marble slab. But my song Ben Bolt had become so popular across Europe and across America that my grave had attracted souvenir hunters. And they came and they chipped away at it. And they chipped away at that stone and they chipped away until, well, frankly, there was very little of it that was left. Well, the town people came together one more time and got me another stone. It was of Tennessee gray granite. My wife and my daughter, they continued to perform for the next 30 years until my wife had passed away over in Ohio. And she was buried over there. But then my daughter decided it would be best if my wife and I were buried together. So she had my wife transported to Chillicothe, and we are buried now side by side up on the top of the hill over there where we're looking down on the green grassy meadows. And on some warm summer nights, it's like you can almost hear the song Ben Bolt as it comes down off that gentle breeze. Don't you remember sweet Alice, Ben Bolt, sweet Alice whose hair was so brown, how she wept with the light when you gave her a smile, and trembled with tears at her frown. In the old churchyard in the valley, Ben Bolt, in a corner obscure and alone, of granite so great, sweet Alice lies under the stone. How they fitted a slab of granite so great, sweet Alice lies under the stone.
My name is Newton Jasper Hicks, and as you can see, I was a Civil War soldier. I'm not the only Civil War veteran that's buried out here in Edgewood. Over by Sheriff Jennings' stone, there are 3 matching stones for the McBride brothers. All in all, there's about 210 Civil War veterans buried here in Edgewood, 6 of whom were nurses. There are other veterans buried out here as well. There's about 5 from the Mexican War, 11 from the Spanish-American War, 172 from World War I, 248 from World War II, 50 from the Korean War, and 13 from the Vietnam War. Every year, the Vernard Glick Post number 25 from the American Legion puts out 709 flags to mark every veteran's grave on Memorial Day. It's both a beautiful and heartbreaking sight to see how many men and women have offered not only years, but lives in the service of our country. My parents moved here in the mid-1800s, looking for some good soil to plant in. They found it in the Spring Hill area, and so bought some land and started to raise a family. I was born in 1842, and I much enjoyed farming. Me and my brothers helped my father until the Civil War started. We didn't own any slaves. My father always taught us that it wasn't right, but our neighbors did. Livingston County had quite a few slaves during that time, and so it wasn't uncommon to find one family a Union sympathizer and another family not too far away a Confederate. Missouri was split by the Civil War, sending 110,000 troops to go join the Union side, and nearly as many, 90,000, to join the Confederates. The governor of Missouri wanted to secede from the Union, and so called for a constitutional convention. But it was at that same convention the Missouri state delegates decided to stay in the Union and exiled the governor along with the state legislator. The exiled governor took the state seal and joined the Confederate States of America anyway. Missouri was split after this, and after this split, a Grundy County attorney named Jacob Tyndall started organizing a regiment of 1,000 men from our area, and thus was born the 23rd Missouri Volunteer Infantry Regiment. I signed on to the Union forces in 1862, January, and my brother signed on with me, much to the dismay of our mother. And we moved down to St. Louis in March to be signed on into the federal forces. There we received uniforms, equipment, and weapons, and on the 1st of April we took riverboats down to Pittsburgh Landing near Shiloh, Tennessee. It would take many hours for me to relay to you what I saw at the Battle of Shiloh, but suffice to say it was the bloodiest two-day battle the Civil War ever saw, with over 18,000 men killed and wounded. Hundreds from the 23rd were killed, including our leader, Colonel Tyndall, with hundreds more being captured at the Hornet's Nest, a farm road in Shiloh that saw some of the heaviest fighting and stopped many of the Confederate onslaughts. Those who were captured were marched down to Corinth, Mississippi, and then to Memphis, to be taken by train to the prisoner of war camp, Oglethorpe. Others were taken to Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia. Those of us who weren't captured or killed were sent to St. Louis to wait for our friends in prisoner of war camps to be paroled out. Prisoner exchanges were pretty common in those days, so it didn't take long for them to get paroled. Things were pretty confusing in St. Louis during 1962, so I took the time to slip back home and visit my family. I had a pretty girl waiting for me, and in September of '62, I married my wife, Susan. While I was home, a couple of bushwhackers, Confederates who were defending their local interests, heard that I was home and decided to come pay me a visit. They came up to our cabin, guns drawn, ready to shoot. Luckily for me, my wife Susan did some quick thinking and opened up her chest where she kept her sewing and darning. I jumped in, and by the time the bushwhackers got to our front door, I was already hidden. She did some pretty good storytelling with them, told them that I'd already been there, but I was gone, and oh, her poor heart was breaking. They bought every word of it and left without firing a single round. As soon as the traveling was good, I headed back to St. Louis to regroup with the regiment. And I spent the entirety of 1863 with the regiment. I participated in campaigns against Marmaduke and Shelby, as well as in campaigns in Cape Girardeau and Rolla. We regrouped at the end of the year back in St. Louis. I missed a little bit of action in 1864, seeing as I was under arrest. Part of that unauthorized leave seemed to have been noticed. But I was out in a couple of months, and by the end of '64, I participated in the Battle of Atlanta, the Battle of Jamesboro, as well as the March to the Sea. In January of 1865, my 3 years were up, and while I was stationed in Savannah, I was mustered out. I headed straight back home to Chillicothe, and in 9 months' time, I had my first little girl. Me and my wife, Susan, had about 4 kids until she passed on. I remarried at the age of 63 to my second wife, Mary, and we had 5 more kids. Mary was a bit of a spitfire, and we didn't always get along, and so, although it was almost unheard of in those days, we divorced, and I moved up to Kansas. But I always wanted to be buried back here, with my family, where memories abound.
You may not know this, but Chillicothe was the place to be for fine entertainment when I was alive. My name is Luella Myers, and the majestic Luella Grand Theater was named in my honor. I was born Mary Luella Lile, and in 1882 I married a true entrepreneur, Zebulon B. Myers. He already had a successful livery business as a teenager with a stable behind Chillicothe State Bank. He was also in the poultry business, breeding several kinds of fancy chickens, as well as selling eggs. We had a happy home life together, although we were never blessed with any children. We did have a full home, however, as we raised 2 orphan relatives. The livery business wasn't enough for ZB, however, and in 1895 he bought a lot over on Clay Street, and he hired a theater architect from Kansas City to design the Luella Grand Theater. This was known as the finest show house in North Missouri. It had 650 seats and a 60-foot stage. It was the largest between Kansas City and Des Moines. It was designed to be reminiscent of the famous Ford Theater, with a balcony, curved loges, murals, parquet flooring, and colored glass. There was also a very tall section in the back where a wagon would pull in to lift and lower stage curtains and scenery. It was very fancy for our day and very expensive. Why, ZB even sold hundreds of tickets to opening night at the start of construction. Some folks say they paid $5, even $10 per ticket for those. That might not sound like much to you, but that's the equivalent of $300 today. Pretty expensive. ZB brought all kinds of entertainment to Chillicothe. He brought plays and operas, of course, but also boxing and wrestling matches. John Philip Sousa and his band played here in 1900 to a packed house. We barely fit the orchestra on the stage. Oh, we had such good times. But all this success did come at a price. ZB was constantly at odds with the city council over being open on Sunday. Some folks thought that having a theater open on Sunday was a desecration and that we ought to be closed along with the saloons and billiard parlors. Well, my ZB had his way and did many Sunday shows. Later in life, ZB got into politics and even land speculation. In 1938, my ZB passed on in the same house he was born in at 423 Jackson Street. I lasted a mere 8 years later. This stone is one of the most iconic in Edgewood. Can you believe the balls come off a few times? Even though this Missouri red granite is tough stuff quarried down in the boot heel, it weighs almost 3,000 pounds. A couple of decades ago, we had a run-in with a joyriding El Camino. If you can imagine, the car was totaled. Our stone? Barely a scratch. Since I'm your last stop today, let me remind you that we are surrounded by history. Every stone in the cemetery tells a story. Some of those stories are of great people who did great things. Doctors and lawyers and politicians and dentists. Some of those stories are of great people who did things that went unnoticed by the public or the newspapers. Hard-working folks who made our city and our state what it is today. Farmers and businessmen, shopkeepers and housewives, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters who all made an imprint on our community. The changes they made may not be as easy to see as the chiseling in this granite, but their stories are set in stone nonetheless. A tribute to the spirit of the pioneer, a monument to the spirit of Missouri. Thank you so much for coming out today. If you want to see the other stones that are on the tour but not part of this route, you're welcome to look at those now, or you can make your way out to the gate. Again, thank you for coming and sharing some local history with us.